In this video, I'm going to discuss all things animals, or non-human animals rather, in research. A little bit about why we would use animals in research, how that research is done, and how we need to approach issues of validity or accuracy in the usage of animal research when trying to draw conclusions. So first off, I want to give credit to Dr. Matthew McMurray in the psychology department, who initially delivered this guest lecture back in the day, and he's given me permission from here on forward to basically deliver this lecture on his behalf. But he's the expert on animal research, and in particular, if you're interested in biopsychology and or the animal research done at Miami, or you're interested in the neuroscience major, Dr. Matthew McMurray is the person you want to talk to. His research is done exclusively with rats. He has a really cool research program that has a number of different foci, but some really interesting ones have to do with how we make decisions and how early life factors can lead to things like a predisposition for addiction later in life. And again, he does that research entirely with rats, and his research leads to some pretty cool conclusions. And just because it's done with rats doesn't mean we can't, to a certain extent, apply some of those findings to how we understand these same factors in humans. So, for example, given the current opioid crisis, his research is very, very impactful and very, very important. So if any of these things sound interesting to you, definitely be in touch with Dr. McMurray. In terms of why we might want to use non-human animals in research as opposed to humans, there's a number of reasons in general why animal research is done. This is, at its heart, somewhat of an ethical or philosophical discussion. The idea that we use non-human animals in certain capacities that we know we can't have humans used in certain research examples. That being said, if you have a different moral code, if you believe that research using animals is unjust or you don't agree with it, that's a perfectly valid moral code to abide by. But the fact remains that in our world, we do consider non-human animals to be on a different level than humans, and as such, we do currently consider the usage of animals in research to enable us to do different things that we can't with humans. So a major reason why we might use animals in research instead of humans is because something might not be ethical to study in humans. So, for example, exploratory brain surgery, something like that. There's no way a human would be able to consent to such a dangerous and unethical procedure. If someone is getting brain surgery anyways, it would be ethical to collect some data over the course of that surgery, but a more exploratory brain surgery, we can't do that with humans, but we could with non-human animals. Additionally, there's certain lifespan factors that would be impossible to study in humans. So our non-human subjects we can have in the laboratory for the entirety of their lifespan, and we can much more easily control different factors in their life, but that would be unethical to do so with humans. So a major reason why often animals are used in research is because it's not ethical. On that last note about more control over your subjects, this is another reason why we would use non-human animals in research. The human life, there's going to be so many confounds. Everything that we experience over the course of our lifetime contributes to whatever outcomes we experience. So whenever you have human subjects in your research, the idea is whenever you observe a certain effect or notice a certain phenomenon, the question becomes, why did something happen to a human? What factor in their life led them to experience a certain outcome? With humans, it can be hard because we can't have control over everything that happens over the course of a human's lifespan. If there's a characteristic that's too complex to study in humans, well, we can study it in non-human animals. We could have our animal subjects live their entire lifespan in the laboratory, and as such, we can have complete control over all of the factors that can occur over the course of every developmental stage of the life. There's certain factors where there's not enough humans to study any particular topic. So there's a interesting phenomena of what we call orphan diseases. These are diseases that relatively few people experience. I believe the official numerical standards for what qualifies as an orphan disease in the United States is that less than 1 in 100,000 people would experience that disease. Now, that sounds quite rare, but when you think about the fact that there's 350 million people in the United States and 7 billion people in the world, 1 in 100,000 still leaves a lot of people experiencing certain diseases. Some orphan diseases animals can experience too. So, for example, the developmental disease of Batten's, which is a progressive disorder that people are born with that leads to muscular and coordination problems. It is technically an orphan disease, but sheep can actually have Batten's as well. And as such, we can understand a relatively rare disease like Batten's a lot better by studying that disease in sheep. We can understand the prognosis of the disease and we can investigate possible cures or treatments. Most animals have a shorter life cycle than humans. Not all animals have a shorter life cycle than humans, but many do. So, as I mentioned, it's a lot easier to basically have total control over everything that happens over the course of a lifespan in non human animals, and it would just be too difficult to study the human lifespan effectively, given that humans live on average around 80 years. Animals have shorter lifespans that enable us to study both developmental changes, meaning the changes that individuals experience over the course of their lifetime, but also generational factors. You can study how species change and develop over multiple generations. An example of this, a fruit fly, for example, living a very, very short life cycle of, I believe, only a few days, we can study generational effects quite easily. For that reason, fruit flies have been very, very useful in genetics research. But even an animal like a mouse or a rat that only lives a few years, that's still a life cycle that's short enough that we can really effectively study all of the developmental stages of a rat's life. Now, many people, when we come to this point of why we use animals, often suggest that one reason might be that it's cheaper. This is actually not a good reason to use animals because this is actually not the case. It is not cheaper to use non-human animals in research. It's actually more expensive. Think about it this way. Humans often volunteer to participate in studies. Maybe they receive money for their participation, but not always. To use non-human animals in research, those specimens need to be purchased and acquired. They need to be housed. You need to have the space to take care of them. You need to have trained research assistants to help take care of them. Think about all of those costs that go into the acquisition and care of your animal subjects. It actually ends up being typically more expensive when someone is doing non-human animal-based research. So this is actually not a good reason. And another reason is that often we're interested in studying some of the special capabilities that non-human animals have that we don't. So one really fun example of this is all of the novel insights in how dogs, for example, can be really, really useful for certain therapies or to help recognize the symptoms of certain health events in people. So dogs, for example, can help someone with diabetes know when their blood sugar is low. They can help someone with epilepsy know when a seizure is oncoming. There's even been some dogs who seem to have the ability to detect cancer. So non-human animals, it's just the case that there's so many things that humans can't do. And as such, we're really interested in understanding all the ways that non-human animals can help improve our lives because of their special capabilities. In terms of some common animals that are used in research, starting with your mammalian species, the classic examples are going to be your mouse and your rat. On the left there you see a mouse, and on the right you see a rat. These two species are not interchangeable. There are some researchers that exclusively use rats and some that exclusively use mice. So they are obviously similar species, but the rat is substantially larger, it's a bit more intelligent, and it lives a little bit longer. Choice of a mouse versus a rat is going to come down to a variety of factors. But overall, mouse and rats are great options for animal subjects in research because they're small and fairly easy to handle. They're able to pick up a wide variety of behaviors that humans have as well. They're fairly trainable. And so these end up being probably the most commonly used species in scientific research. On there, that bald cutie you see, the naked mole rat. naked mole rats are really, really fascinating because this is an example of a species that has a lot of special capabilities that humans don't have. And that prompts a lot of the study using naked mole rats. One, they're able to survive in very oxygen poor environments. The naked mole rat lives underground where there's not a lot of oxygen saturation. And so understanding that unique capability can help humans learn something about our own respiratory system. Additionally, the naked mole rat is resistant to cancer, which is a really cool capability that humans don't have. So if we could isolate and understand what gives naked mole rats that wonderful capability, that might be something that could eventually lead to some pretty wonderful breakthroughs in cancer research and treatment for humans. Obviously, a variety of monkey, ape, chimpanzee, rhesus macaque. These are very often used in studies when we want to understand something about humans. Given that all things monkeys are our closest evolutionary cousin, they are very, very genetically similar to humans, and they're very, very intelligent. And as such, if we want to understand something like human development or human intelligence or learning, and we want to use an animal to study those topics, an intelligent creature like a monkey is going to be a great option. Rabbits are very, very frequently used in a lot of consumer research, and for example, they're often used in cosmetics testing. In terms of what drives choice of rabbits in, for example, a lot of cosmetics testing, there's not a solid reason why. Likely it's because their eyes are relatively similar to humans, and as such, you can test potential irritants in rabbits' eyes to see how it might affect humans. Other than that, it's likely that, as with mouse and rats, rabbits are relatively docile and easy to handle. You might find that morally objectionable, and you think that there shouldn't even be research testing cosmetics on animals. And that's certainly a position that a lot of people support. The reason some cosmetics companies do use animal testing is A, because they want to make sure that a product is safe for humans, and they choose to weigh the potential damage done to animals as not as important as potentially harming humans, which again, you are completely free to disagree with. More so, I believe it's the case that cosmetics companies are really just making the financial decision. For example, any cosmetics companies that want to sell in the Chinese market are actually legally required to test on animals to be able to access that market. And so for a lot of companies, it's just sort of a craven business decision. Again, if you feel that that's not right, that's morally objectionable, there is a pretty vocal community of people in the cosmetics community who are very supportive of any companies and industries that go vegan and or cruelty free. There's definitely a push in the cosmetics industry for brands to cease all animal testing, and many companies do that. There's a lot of really high profile cosmetics companies that you can get at Sephora, Ulta, or even the drugstore that are cruelty free and don't test on animals. So this is definitely a popular opinion that's getting more and more weight and consideration, and the cosmetic industry, I think, is somewhat paying attention. Dogs and cats, lastly, for your mammalian species, are great options for conducting research. Dogs, for example, because as I mentioned, they have some pretty unique capabilities that humans don't have, and as such, dogs are a great avenue for trying to research things like cancer detection and detecting when seizures are oncoming. Additionally, dogs are an example of a species that also can have diseases in common with humans. For example, the relatively rare disease of hemophilia, which is a blood disorder, dogs can have as well. So we're better able to study that disease in our dog specimens. Cats actually have a really cool place in research history, and I'll show you another example in a second, but one really, really famous research area that cats are heavily involved in was actually some really cool old advances in perceptual science. So classic studies by researchers Hubert and Wiesel, I think their names were, who discovered the receptive field, basically the idea that when you're looking into space, you have specific cells that are dedicated to seeing various shapes in any place in your visual field. There's like a single cell for being able to see a straight line at 45 degrees from your pupil. This discovery was made with cats because their ocular system is pretty similar to ours. Here are just a few links if you're interested in any of these particular topics. Animal research, again, is a really cool topic. The justification for how and why animals are used in research, again, I encourage you to have your own opinion on the issue and think about the sort of moral and ethical boundaries and whether or not any of these reasons for animals being used in research and any of the historical examples of these animals being used for research sits well with you. And on that note, like I said, I wanted to talk more about cats. Since everybody loves cats and the internet, I wanted to talk a little bit more about some really cool historical facts about just how important cats were actually in space-related research. One fun famous cat that you might not have heard of, Felicette, depicted there to the left, was actually the first cat to ever survive a trip into space. She was a French stray, and as you can see, she had a little electrode planted into her brain, and she was sent up into space, and she came back safe and sound. And so she's a bit of a hero cat in terms of the history of space research. Additionally, and I'm going to show you a short video because, like I said, who doesn't love cat videos on the internet? There's a really interesting history of cats actually being used in some research on how humans could acclimate to zero gravity environments and thus acclimate to being in space. So if you think about cats, here's an example of them having a special capabilities that humans really don't. Cats are exceedingly graceful, and if you've ever dropped a cat, you'll know that they're always able to land on their feet. They always land on their feet, even if when they fall, they were sort of upside down. They have this really cool capability to gracefully reorient themselves so that they always land on their feet. This really cool reorientation capability that humans don't have, I can tell you from personal experience that humans can fall down on all sorts of dumb ways. But if we could harness this ability that cats have to flexibly reorient ourselves, maybe we could use that to understand how humans could do so. And so there's some really interesting old space research that looked a little bit something like this. What we do for the name of science.
In these experiments, you can see the disorientation resulting when an animal is suddenly placed in a weightless state. Cats, when dropped under normal conditions, will invariably rotate their bodies longitudinally in midair and land on their feet. This automatic reflex action is almost completely lost under weightlessness.
He kicked that cat! So this research, as goofy as it seemed, was actually used to develop some guidelines that the Air Force used to try and give astronauts going into space ideas about how they can best reorient themselves to acclimate to a weightless state. So those are all your mammalian species, your cute and cuddlies, but it's not always cute and cuddly animals that are useful in research. There's a whole host of non-mammalian species that are used as well. As I alluded to earlier, your classic fruit fly study, your Drosophila, I believe it's called, is very famously part of a lot of genetics research and advancements in understanding, for example, how traits change over the course of generations. And this, the use of the fruit fly is really important because their very, very short lifespan makes it much easier to study generational and genetic factors over the course of many generations. Your Xenopus, the African clawed frog, here's an example of a creature that surprisingly has a ton of genetic overlap with humans. I mean, basically any mammal or non-mammalian species is going to have a ton of genetic overlap with humans. I mean, we share most of our genetics with like a banana, I think. So really, we could take some pretty large arrays of mammalian or non-mammalian species, and mapping out their genetics gives us more insight into human genetics as well. So famously, the African clawed frog has been used in genomic projects. The axolotl here, that's pretty cute. This is an example of an animal that we study because of a unique capability that humans don't have, namely cellular and limb regeneration. So axolotls, when they lose a limb, are able to completely regenerate a new one from scratch. Again, this is the sort of capability that humans don't have, and it would be so fantastic if we could harness our understanding of this special capability that axolotls have to drive an advancement to our understanding of maybe prosthetics in humans that have lost limbs. Cockroaches, given their very small brain, have interestingly been used in some really cool sort of mind control research. As you can see there is some pretty creepy research done to affix a brain to brain interface into a cockroach, and it enabled the researchers to basically use the cockroach like a little remote control car. Obviously, the kind of thing that's sort of the realm of sci-fi, and obviously you'd never be able to do that in humans, but that does give an indication that there are definitely some possibilities in the brain-to-brain interface realm, which for humans could end up being really useful, again, in this sort of advancement of prosthetics fields. If we could have people's brain connect to a prosthetic device, individuals who had experienced an amputation would probably have a much higher degree of control over their prosthetic limb. The zebrafish, again, we've got a special capability, namely heart regeneration. Given how common heart disease is, particularly in the United States, I believe it is the #1 killer. If we could understand how to regenerate heart tissue, this could go a long way in helping human health. And then lastly, here's a cool example of another famous instance of an animal being used in some really famous and seminal research. The longfin inshore squid has the longest axon known to science. So the longfin inshore squid really famously had their nervous system mapped out, and it gave a lot of advancement to our understanding of the nervous system. So overall, in terms of choosing any one species or the other, there really is a lot of thoughtfulness that needs to go into the choice of which species to use. As I've mentioned, use of any particular species might be because there's some unique or distinct capability that the animal has that humans don't. Another fun fact is that research on magnetoreception, or the ability to detect the magnetic fields of the earth, can be studied in animals that have the natural sense to be able to perceive the magnetic fields of the earth. So lobsters, for example, have this really cool sense that humans don't. Now, on the other hand, again, as I've alluded to, sometimes animals are used because of their similarity to humans. So if you're talking why lab mice are so commonly used in research, it's because there is a ton of genetic similarity between humans and animals. And mice can mimic a lot of the same basic behavioral capabilities that humans do. So mice are just sort of in that sweet spot where they're similar enough to us and they have enough genetic similarity, but they're sort of small enough and easy enough to handle that they're sort of the ideal choice for most researchers. In terms of being able to have more control over your animal species, like I mentioned, this is an upside. The idea that you can have your animal species in the laboratory for the duration of their lifespan, that's a good thing because you can get rid of confounds. You can have complete control over everything that occurs over an animal's lifespan. But it's important to note that there's a trade-off where the simplicity of these animals' lives in the laboratory completely gets rid of all of the complexity of human experience. Human lives are complex, and understanding human lives based on the sort of simplified experience that animals have in a laboratory, no animal research is ever going to be able to help us perfectly understand what's true about the human experience. So, animal research, particularly when we're trying to glean some information about humans, it's really important to keep in mind that animal research can't help us completely understand what's true about humans. It can sort of give us some insight and give us some directions. But if you really want to understand whatever you're studying in animal research and apply it to humans, you would need to replicate that research on humans themselves. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the process of getting your animal research approved. You might think that choice of non-human animals in research is going to be because you can basically get away with anything. that you could sort of do whatever you want to animals because there's not the same ethical considerations as humans. Well, that's definitely true. The ethical considerations and standards are different for non human animals, but that doesn't mean that it's a free for all. There's actually some very strict controls on the usage of non human animals in research. It's as strict or probably stricter than human based research. In terms of how it's enforced and how exactly the rules go, it's a little bit distinct. So I'm going to walk through that process. Oversight of ethics and approval for animal based research in the United States is actually the purview of the United States Department of Agriculture. This is distinct from the enforcement of human based research, which is under the purview of, I believe, Health and Human Services. Enforcement of animal care in research is going to come down from the USDA. In terms of what the USDA enforces, the codified law that sets standards for animals in research is the Animal Welfare Act. This act broadly covers standards for all animal facilities, not just facilities where research occurs. So your veterinarian's office, animal shelters, as well as laboratories and farms. There's standards for any facilities where animals are used basically besides family pet. Part of what the USDA enforces is that any institution that wants to do animal based research needs to have a committee that is willing to review and approve any proposed animal based research. So, whereas for human based research at an institution, we have what's called the IRB or the Institutional Review Board, the equivalent committee for animal based research is going to be the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee or the IACUC. This is going to be the committee that reviews proposals for animal based research. So, any institution that wants to do that research needs to have this committee formed. So, for example, Miami University has various programs of animal based research, including at the psychology department. If you didn't know, in the basement of the psychology department, there's all sorts of rat laboratories and mouse laboratories. So Miami needs to have an IACUC to review and approve that research. There's strict guidelines for how the committee needs to be constituted. There needs to be 5 members at least, and there needs to be a variety of roles that the members fill. So you need to have at least one veterinarian, you need to have a research scientist, you need to have a non-scientist, you need to have a member of the community that's not affiliated with the university. This role can be just some other perspective that's useful in conducting research and animal based research. So, maybe someone who's a philosopher or an ethicist, or maybe a lawyer to look after legal considerations. And then you need to have a 5th member that can be from any of these categories. That's federal based oversight. State by state, there's the possibility for further controls and regulation. Some states don't have any. For example, Ohio doesn't have any state based regulations. So if you're doing animal based research in the state of Ohio, you just answer to the USDA. But California, for example, has some stricter regulations than other states. So if you want to do animal based research in California, you need to get approval from the state as well. If you receive external funding, there might be standards set by whoever is giving you the money. So the Public Health Service, for example, has the Office of Lab Animal Welfare. So if you're getting grant money from any institution or governmental body, they may have their own standards that you need to meet. And then additionally, if you're talking animal rights, there are nonprofits who specifically are or have the mission to make sure that animals are treated well, including in research settings. So, for example, ALEC, the Association for Assessment and Accreditation of Laboratory Animal Care, they're a nonprofit that might do their own oversight. And even though they couldn't necessarily enforce anything on an institution, they certainly could highlight institutions who are not doing the right thing, maybe get some bad publicity going. Then People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, or PETA. They're a very famous nonprofit that claims to be about animal rights. And we're probably all familiar with how PETA will definitely try and throw some bad publicity on institutions or corporations who don't treat animals well. I would like to caution you against completely trusting PETA. They actually have a really bad reputation once you dig into actually the way they conduct themselves. For example, PETA does not have a no-kill policy in their animal shelters. So they actually kill the vast majority of animals that come under their care. They've actually had some pretty bad publicity directed towards them, actually, for animal cruelty. They have a weird habit of kidnapping personal pets whenever they're able and sticking them in their kill shelters. It's a total mess. I have a very poor opinion of PETA because digging into their ethics and behavior a little bit deeper, I find them to be quite hypocritical and not helpful whatsoever. ALEC, in my opinion, is a reputable nonprofit who we should pay attention to when they're trying to highlight issues. But PETA, garbage. All right, so if you want to do some animal research, you have to submit an application to your institution's IACUC. So linked there, you can see information about Miami's IACUC, the specific language that each institution might have for an application might vary a little bit, but it's basically always going to include at least some necessary bullet points. So first off, within the application, there needs to be a scientific justification for using animals. You need to definitely have a reason why you need to use animals instead of humans, and you need to justify your decision. So you can't just decide to use animals because it's easier and say screw it. You need to have a really good solid reason. So either a unique capability that animals have, a unique reason that the research would be impossible with humans, so on and so forth. You additionally need a scientific justification for the number of animals to be used and the species you chose. So you need to say why you want to use rats or lobsters or whatever it may be, and you need to have a target number. You don't have carte blanche to get as many animal species as you want. You need to have a specific idea of how many animal specimens you're going to need. The idea is we still care about animals, and we don't want animals to unnecessarily go through the process of being subjected to research more than necessary. You need to outline any procedures or drugs that you will administer to help make the animals more comfortable. If animals are going to be experiencing pain or discomfort, it is your duty to make sure that you have an idea of how you can minimize that and make it as comfortable as possible. So again, just because the ethical consideration for non-human animals is different doesn't mean we don't care at all. You need to have a thorough description of your methods, and you need to indicate that you searched for alternatives to painful or uncomfortable procedures, and you exhausted your search if you are going to do anything that's painful or uncomfortable. You additionally need to do a pretty thorough literature review. You need to explain why this proposal proposes novel research. The idea being that if research has basically already been done, we can spare the animals any pain or discomfort that they might experience being part of the research. So you definitely need to justify that this research needs to happen because it would uncover novel insights. So again, if you were thinking that animal research is beneficial because it's a lot easier to do than human research, this application hopefully disabuses you of that notion. It's pretty intensive. Once IACUC receives your proposal, each member is going to review and make their assessment. They can accept it or reject it, or they can ask for any revisions that they request before accepting the study. Typically, the committee is going to have your proposal for around a month. I have no idea what's going on in ye coronavirus times, whether or not this has been extended or whether or not these review processes can all happen remotely. But typically, historically, it's been at least a month. And as I mentioned, the different members of the committee are meant to bring their unique perspectives to the table. So you want a veterinarian or an ethicist, people who are going to look at things from the point of view of how to protect the animals, a scientist to look at it from the point of view of good quality science. So whoever is in the committee is meant to bring their perspective to the table so that the proposal is looked at from all angles. In terms of interpretation or validity of animal research, the same considerations for measurement accuracy, reliability, and validity is applicable to animal research as well. So we can think of our animals as just a different research tool, the same as any self report questionnaire. And as such, we need to make sure that the tool is valid. So if we're using animal-based research to try and discover something about humans, the idea is that we need to be cautious in interpreting the extent to which animal-based research will generalize to humans. Some things to remember is that animals are distinct from humans, and as such, any conclusions or findings that you make with your animal based research is not going to be immediately perfectly applicable to humans. The way a disease shakes out in a non human animal and a human may be different, and that's okay. So, when we're doing animal based research, it's okay if the animal subjects don't have the exact same prognosis, symptoms, etc. of a disease. Typically, researchers are really going to focus in on maybe one particular symptom of the disease, or maybe they're really interested in developing a new tool or cure. And as such, they're really just trying to make those breakthroughs with animals, knowing that it can't be immediately applicable to humans. And on that note, do make sure if you're ever reading about animal based research from non academic or non scientific sources to interpret cautiously. So often, conclusions from animal based research are reported as if the research was done in humans. The Twitter thread that I've linked here is to one of my favorite Twitter accounts to follow, Dr. Vinay Prasad, whose Twitter mission is to blow up really poorly done or reported research. And he was highlighting that some research that came out a couple years ago on the health effects of caffeine were actually done with mice. And the research was reported as if the research was done with humans, people being like, oh, great, I can drink as much coffee as I want. Well, that research was done in mice, and mice have different hearts than humans. And as such, if it's a research area like that, you really want to make sure that you're interpreting with caution and taking it with a grain of salt. Animal research conclusions do not immediately map onto humans. Findings and conclusions from animal based research need to be cautiously generalized to humans, and ideally, the research needs to be replicated and recreated using human subjects. There's even an entire Twitter account called Just Say Mice that highlights any time the reporting on research neglects to indicate that mice were the subject pool in the title. And every time they find any research reported like this, their tweet content just says, just say mice. Because really, there's this tendency to over exaggerate the extent to which animal research applies to humans. So, then lastly, to close this out, I know I mentioned that animal research is the kind of thing where you are obviously free to come to your own conclusion and your own opinion on whether you think animal research is okay or if you think that it's an abhorrent practice that we shouldn't do. Overall, I would leave you with the idea that animal based research has been tremendously beneficial for the advent of a lot of really important research breakthroughs. So, some really important breakthroughs in medical treatment, for example, initially were discovered in animal models. It's a lot harder to come up with these really crazy breakthroughs in treatment if we're testing on humans, because again, we can't necessarily recklessly pioneer experimental treatments in humans. A lot of the most famous treatments, anything from antibiotics to chemotherapy, were initially pioneered using animal research. And I would say overall, it's easy to see that animal based research has been a tremendous benefit to human health and well being. And to drive this point home of the importance of animal based research, a fun fact is that every Nobel Prize in medicine since 1979, except for one, has been the result of animal based research. So, again, this drives home the point that advancements in medicine really rely on the usage of animal based research to enable us to do that. So, definitely, I see the validity of the viewpoint that animal research is problematic, but at the same time, human health would be obviously quite far from where it is if we didn't have these animal subjects to rely on. And despite the fact that there is a part of me that thinks that animal based research is problematic and we shouldn't rely on it as much, do keep in mind that breakthroughs in animal research benefit animals too. So, any procedures used by your veterinarian were initially developed through animal research. So, pioneers in research on veterinary sciences are going to be the result of animal based research as well. So, at least we can hope that any breakthroughs that occur because of animal based research will actually benefit our animal friends as well. So, on that note, I'm filming this like a week late, so sorry you did an ethics discussion last week. I hope that was great. And I'm done. All right. I will talk to you soon.